Hey, you guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. All right. Today, we're going to be talking about Joe Aiello, one of the many men who clashed with Al Capone for control over Chicago in the 1920s. Unlike most of Al's beefs, this had nothing to do with bootlegging. It was all political. Joe Aiello was the rare criminal without a criminal record, and that was due to him waiting until he was almost 40 years old to become a gangster. But before we get into Joe, I need to talk to you guys. All right. Views have been down lately. And I don't think the quality of the videos have gone down, so it seems like I'm fighting against the algorithm. So to my core guys and gals, the guys I know are going to watch this video, I need you guys to do me a favor. I need you to share this video on your social media, comment, and watch the full video if you can, or maybe a little longer than usual. That'll let the YouTube bosses know that we mean business over here. All right? And if that doesn't work, I might have to send some of my boys over to see this algorithm guy and bust them up. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. All right, now, enough of this business talk. Let's get into this. Giuseppe Aiello was born in the town of Bagria, Sicily on September 27, 1890. He was the first of at least 7 siblings. And at 17, he moved to the U.S. and settled in Utica, New York with 3 of his brothers. They worked as laborers in a pipe molding factory until Joe met and married Caterina Amara. In 1919, things changed for Joe. His first son was born and he may or may not have shot a guy named Antonio Gagliano, which forced him to leave town. With the cops on his heels, he made his way to Chicago and settled in the Little Sicily section on the north side. The 22nd Ward was originally the home of Scandinavian immigrants, and it was first known as Little Hell. But by 1920, it had become one of the most popular places to settle for Sicilian immigrants, and 20,000 of them packed a small neighborhood between Chicago Ave and Division Street. In 1920, Joe became a wholesale food distributor along with Antonio Lombardo, another Sicilian. I'm not sure how they met, but their partnership would make them rich men in a few years. When Prohibition went into effect in January of 1920, Aiello and Lombardo realized that they were sitting on a gold mine. One of the items they sold was sugar, and sugar was used by bootleggers in homemade stills to produce alcohol. Aiello and Lombardo sold sugar to bootleggers throughout the Chicago area, but their main customers were the Jenner brothers. The Jenners controlled Little Sicily and had stills and homes of dozens of immigrants. Little Sicily was a small neighborhood on the north side, and the north side for the most part was run by the gang of mostly Irishmen, led by Charles Dean O'Banion. The north side gang clashed with the Jenners for years, and they were the arch enemies of the gang on the south side run by Johnny Torrio and Al Capone. But that's for another story. Aiello and Lombardo stayed out of the conflicts. They sold to both sides and they focused on getting rich, and that they did. With his money, Joe opened several bakeries with his brothers and built a huge house for himself and his growing family at the southeast corner of Lunt and Rockwell in the new Rogers Park Manor development. Lombardo and Aiello became rich legitimately. By the mid-20s, they were pulling in 6 figures a year. The Antonio Lombardo and Company had a stranglehold on sugar sales. If you were a bootlegger in Chicago, you bought your sugar from Joe Aiello and Antonio Lombardo. Now, they didn't get this monopoly because they were nice guys or great businessmen. They had help. In the early 1920s, they aligned themselves with the Unionne Sicilianne and Mike Merlo, who was the union president. The Unionne, which as I spoke of before, was an organization that unionized legitimate Sicilian workers around the country, and in Chicago, they had over 15,000 members paying dues. It started off with good intentions, but it was soon infiltrated by gangsters. To be the president of the union was to be a powerful person. He could deliver the 22nd Ward to any politician who had the pockets to buy it. And he was the go-between for the gangsters and the politicians. Mike Merlo kept the peace. He settled disputes, dictated policy, and saw that it was followed. When there was dissent, he had it dealt with. For the most part, Merlo was the boss of the bosses in Chicago. The Northsiders, the Jenners, and the Torrio Capone gang all followed his lead. On November 9th, 1925, Mike Merlo died of cancer, and the entire Chicago underworld erupted into warfare. Beefs that had been simmering for years spilled over into the streets. The first to go was Dean O'Banion, killed in his flower shop days after Merlo's death by Jenner gunmen Albert Anselmi and John Scalise as he shook hands with Frankie Yale, Capone's friend from Brooklyn. In fact, most of the violence that made Chicago infamous in the 20s can be traced back to Merlo's death. Several of those people killed were direct results of his death. His passing left a void. The presidency of the Union was a prized position. It brought along with it tremendous power in the Italian community, ward politics, and not to mention the money that could be made. It was a job to die for, literally. Joe Aiello had his eyes on the job, but his ally Mike Jenner won the election. He held it for a few months before he was killed in a shootout with police on June 13, 1925. The next man up was Salvatore Samuzza Matuna, another Jenner man. On November 10th, Samoots went into a barbershop at 804 West Roosevelt Road. He was loved by everyone in the neighborhood. He had helped many immigrant families, and he was greeted warmly when he entered the shop for a quick shave before a night at the opera. As the barber was removing the cape, two men walked quickly into the shop, and shots rang out. 8 times the pistols popped. 7 shots went wild, but one caught Samoots in the neck and came out under the shoulder blade, narrowly missing his spine. He was carried to a taxi, and he told the driver to take him to a cigar shop at 814 Taylor Street, where he alerted his friends before being transported to the hospital, where he died a few days later. Again, Joe Aiello thought that he should be named president, but he had competition. Another man had his eyes on the seat too. Al Capone was not a Sicilian, so he was not eligible to be the president. But if he was able to get a man loyal to him elected, he could control the Union from behind the scenes. And the man he chose to support was Antonio Lombardo. When Lombardo got the job, he and Aiello fell out. This is when Joe Aiello turned from sugar salesman and cheese merchant into a gangster. Aiello expanded his operation. He and his brothers took over the Little Sicily Stills, formerly run by the Jenners, opened gambling houses and ran extortion rings. Joe then allied himself with other men on the north side who also had issues with Capone, guys like Billy Skidmore and John Zutter. In 1927, he began his campaign to be the biggest pain in the ass to Al Capone at every turn. In the spring of 1927, Joe began his plans to make the Union presidency vacant again, and he set out to kill his old pal Lombardo and his new boss, Al Capone. In May 1927, Joe Aiello offered to cook at Al's favorite restaurant at 4805 West 22nd Street in Cicero $10,000 to put prussic acid into Al and Lombardo's minestrone soup the next time they came in. But the chef valued his life more than the $10,000, and he told Al about the plan. The next day, Capone retaliated. On May 28th, Tony and Dominic Aiello were in the Aiello Company pastry shop at 473 West Division Street, along with 2 other men. Outside, a limousine pulled up, and someone stuck a Tommy gun through the curtained back window, and shots rang out. Hundreds of bullets smashed through the plate glass window. The men inside ducked for cover. Tony Aiello fell to the floor and yelled, "I'm dead!" He had been struck in the neck. Charles DeLeo was also hit in the side, but both men would survive. After this, Joe Aiello increased the bounty on Capone to $50,000. He allegedly brought in 2 shooters from St. Louis to deal with Al, but they were soon discovered and disposed of in the alley on the north side. Joe Aiello felt that if he couldn't lead the Union, he would start his own. He sent men to St. Louis and started a rival to the Union there. This resulted in over a dozen shootings, most on Aiello's side, and Joe's boys limped back to Chicago. Joe was determined to get Lombardo and Capone out of the way so he could become the biggest gangster in Chicago. On November 21st, 1927, acting on the tip, the Chicago police raided an apartment near Joe's house. They found rifles, ammo, and dynamite. They arrested Angelo Lamontio, an imported Milwaukee gunman, along with 4 others. When they searched Lamontio's pocket, they found 2 rent receipts. One for an apartment at 4442 Washington Boulevard. That address just so happened to be across the street from where Tony Lombardo lived. The other one was for a room at the Atlantic Hotel. At the Washington Street location, they found a machine gun nest and binoculars. At the hotel, they found 2 high-powered rifles clamped to the windowsill, aimed at the cigar shop of Hinky Dink Kenner, a place Al visited almost daily. Lamontio confessed that Aiello had paid him $5,000 in advance to kill Capone and Lombardo, and Aiello was arrested. The Capone forces found out, and within minutes, sedans began to pull up in front of the police station. 4 or 5 men hopped out of each car and fanned out, covering all exits. When an officer looked out of the window onto Clark Street, he noticed a trio of men staring back at him. One of them pulled his overcoat back, revealing a pistol. Still making eye contact with the officer, he patted his gun in his shoulder holster defiantly. The officer gathered a few more cops, went outside, and arrested the 3 men. Frank Perry, Samuel Marcus, and Louis Little New York Campagna were all known Capone men. The 3 men were placed in the cell next to Aiello's, and an officer who spoke Sicilian was placed in the cell with Aiello in plain clothes, and he was able to translate what was said between the 2 enemies. "Can't we settle this thing?" Aiello pleaded. "Give me 15 days, just 15 days, and I'll sell my stores and my house and I'll leave everything in your hands. Just think of my wife and my baby and let me go." "You dirty rat, you started this thing, and we'll end it. You're as good as dead now," was the reply. When Joe was arraigned, he asked for and received a police escort home. He told the police that he was going back to Sicily. He packed his bags, gathered his family, and left town. But really, he took his family and hid out in Camden, New Jersey. On the East Coast, he teamed up with Frankie Yale, the National Union president. Capone and Yale were once allies, but fell out after Lombardo was named president. Frankie thought that it was funny. As soon as Lombardo took over, his envelope started getting lighter and lighter. Joe Aiello and Frankie Yale had several meetings. Al had a spy in Frankie's organization, and he informed him. On July 1st, 1928, Frankie Yale was shot to death by gunmen sent by Al Capone as he drove up Utrecht Avenue in Brooklyn. Back in Chicago, Capone let it be known that the Aiellos were done here. For months, the Aiello businesses remained closed. In January of 28, when Joe's brother Dominic tried to reopen his bakery, he received a phone call warning him not to do so. He didn't listen. On January 4th, 1928, two men walked into the bakery with Tommies and sprayed the place with bullets. No one was hurt, but the message was sent. Joe Aiello was spending his time on the East Coast, mostly in Buffalo, under the protection of Stefano Magaddino. He also built a relationship with Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was ready to take on the most powerful boss in America, Joe Masseria. Masseria was no friend of Aiello's. Masseria, for the most part, was Al Capone's boss, or at least Al recognized him as boss. And when the Castellammarese War broke out, Joe Aiello threw his support behind Maranzano and donated $5,000 a week to the war chest. Maranzano also had plans on taking over the Union, and Joe the Boss was in the way of that too. All this was good for Joe Aiello. If Masseria was gone, that would weaken Capone. Throughout 1928, Joe Aiello spent his time traveling. He went to Cleveland, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, trying to drum up support from Union leaders. In the summer, he snuck back into Chicago and teamed up with Bugs Moran, the leader of the North Side. Moran hated Capone as much as Aiello, and a deal was struck. Bugs Moran and the North Side gang would help Joe Aiello become Union president. The first order of business was Antonio Lombardo. On September 7th, 1928, Antonio was in his office at the Italian National Union, the rebranded name for the Unionne Sicilianne, in room 1102 in the Hartford building at 8 South Dearborn Street. At around 4:30, Tony left the office accompanied by Joseph Lolordo and Joseph Ferraro, his so-called bodyguards. They turned west on the south side of Madison Street. Tony knew that his life was in danger, but he thought that he would be safe here in the loop. No one would be bold enough to try to kill him here. This was the busiest street in the world, and in fact, as Tony and his pals made their way down Madison, thousands of people gathered to see a real airplane hoisted up the side of the Boston Store building to be displayed in a window. Tony and the two Joes were also looking up, unaware of the two men who slipped out of a doorway as they passed. After walking just 50 feet, two men walked behind Tony. They pulled guns from their coat pockets. One of them placed a gun behind Tony's ear, and shots rang out. Two dum-dum bullets crashed into the back of Tony's head behind his right ear. He was dead before his body pitched forward and landed face first onto the sidewalk. Joseph Ferraro caught a slug in the back of the neck, which severed his spine. Joseph Lolordo was able to get his gun out and gave chase to the two shooters who dropped their guns and slipped into the crowd. He lost them and was grabbed by the cops who thought that he was one of the shooters. They told him who he was and that he didn't want to shoot because he might hit an innocent bystander. Gunman Frank Gusenberg and Bugs Moran himself made a clean getaway. When the cops arrived at the scene, Ferraro was down but still alive. The cops told him he wouldn't make it, and they asked him who shot him. He said nothing. 2 days later, he would die from his injuries. When the reporters came to Lombardo's house to get a statement from his wife, she was in the middle of cooking Tony's dinner and answered the door expecting to see her husband. Surprised, she asked the reporter, "Did something happen to my husband?" The reporter, realizing that she hadn't heard, put his head down. "Your husband's been hurt, ma'am." "Is it serious? Is he okay? What hospital is he in?" The reporter didn't respond. "Is he dead? Tell me he's not dead." The reporter nodded. His wife became hysterical. She opened the door and told her son, who was playing in the yard, "Your daddy's dead. You got no father anymore. And he was good to us." Antonio Lombardo received the gangster's funeral, with caravans of cars carrying thousands of dollars worth of flowers. When Lombardo died, Aiello again thought that it was his turn, but instead Lombardo's vice president, Pasqualino Paty Lolordo, the brother of Joseph, was elevated to the top spot. To say that Joe Aiello was disappointed would be an understatement. At one time, Patsy and Joe were good friends, but now he was in the way. Joe's new North Side allies were not good with being political. They settled their disputes with lead. Bugs Moran told Joe that if he wanted the job, he would have to get his hands dirty. January 8th, 1929 started like any other day for Paty Lolordo. He had been president of the Union for 4 months now, and things were looking up for him. Patsy and his wife Alina spent the afternoon shopping in downtown Chicago. At 2:30, they arrived home, and two men were waiting for Patsy. His wife knew the men well. They had visited many times before. They all went inside, and Mrs. Lolordo made lunch. The men ate and talked for half an hour, and at 3 o'clock, Patsy walked the two men to the door. 5 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Patsy opened it to find 3 more men. He greeted them with a smile and invited them in. They took chairs in the living room, and Patsy closed the sliding door, a signal to his wife that he did not want to be disturbed. Alina was in the kitchen for an hour. From the living room, she heard the men laughing and clinking glasses. But at 4 p.m., the laughing stopped, and shots rang out. Alina ran out the kitchen and was pushed aside by the 3 men hurrying out the front door. She went into the living room and found Paty Lolordo dead from multiple gunshots. She placed a velvet pillow under his head and stayed by her dying husband. When her sister-in-law, Joe Lolordo's wife, came in, she called the cops. At the station, she identified Joe Aiello through a photo as one of the first pair that came into the house. When Patsy's son, who was away at the University of Illinois, heard there was a call for him, the first thing he said was, "Did someone kill my father?" After Lolordo's death, Joe Aiello went to hide in Buffalo. The Capone gang struck back against the Moran-led Northside gang on February 14, 1929. 7 Moran men were killed in a garage on Clark Street. Moran escaped, but his gang was in ruin. While Joe was gone, another former gentleman, Joseph Guinta, was named president. But Guinta was a puppet, and the real power behind him was John Scalise, one of the killers of Dean O'Banion. He and his partner, Albert Anselmi, had both been Jenner gunmen, but were now with Capone. On May 7, 1929, the bodies of Al Guinta, John Scalise, and Albert Anselmi were found in an abandoned car in Hammond, Indiana. They were found with several gunshots each. The rear seat had been removed and replaced with the 3 bodies, and a blanket was thrown over the corpses. That summer, Al Capone was arrested in Philadelphia with a pistol. He was sentenced to a year in jail, possibly on purpose. It was safer in jail. Jake Lingle. Now, Jake Lingle was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, and he was on the police beat for the paper. Jake was available at all hours of the night. Whenever a wise guy got clipped, Jake would be there to get the skinny and dictate the story to a desk writer who put it in ink. He was well known and liked amongst the gangsters of Chicago, but he got too close to the people he was supposed to report on, and to make it worse, he chose sides. Jake began to get close with the Capone gang. Capone would later say in an interview that Jake was one of the boys. He partnered with Al on a few businesses, dog racing tracks, and even vacationed with Al in Florida. Despite being paid $65 a week from the Tribune, Jake had a new Lincoln limousine with a chauffeur and had just bought a $16,000 home. How he got all this money, who knows? But Jake didn't realize that he was out of his league. He was just a lamb pretending to be a lion. Jake had pissed off the wrong guy, and now someone wanted to kill him, and he knew it. He even told a police officer friend that he was being followed. On June 9, 1930, Jake Lingle left his office at the Tribune and ate lunch at the coffee shop at the Hotel Sherman. At 1:15, he left and walked up Randolph Street, headed for the Illinois Central Suburban Station to catch a 1:30 train to the racetracks at Washington Park. Jake had the same bad habits as the men he covered and would rub shoulders with the men at the tracks. He stopped to get a newspaper and a racing form from a newspaper stand and headed to the station. Before he crossed the street, he was hailed from a car containing 2 men. "Hey, Jake, don't forget to play High Snyder in the 9th. Jake laughed, waved his hand and said, "I've got him." As he went down the stairs to the train platform, 2 men joined him. One of them was Jack Zuda, an ally to Joe Aiello. During the walk, the other man stopped to get a newspaper, lagging behind a few feet. The witnesses said he walked up behind Jake, pulled the pistol, and shots rang out. The shooter put 1 bullet into the back of Jake's head before dropping the pistol. He stepped over Jake's body and ran up the tunnel, hopped the fence, and escaped up Michigan Avenue. Jake Lingle, a beat reporter, had $9 grand in his pocket. Carl and Dominic Aiello were arrested for the murder and sat in a cell all summer. They would eventually be released. Frank Foster was charged with the murder. He was a Northsider, and the gun left at the scene once belonged to him, but the charges would be dropped. Eventually, a man named Leo Brothers, a St. Louis shooter, was arrested in New York. He was found guilty of the murder, and he was sentenced to 14 years. On July 1st, Jack Zuda was hauled into the police station to answer questions about the Lingle murder. After his interrogation, he was being driven home by a police officer. As they rolled down State Street, a curtained automobile pulled alongside, and shots rang out. Zuda ducked down, and Lieutenant George Barker returned fire, but the car got away. Unfortunately, motor carman Elbert Luciter was struck by a stray bullet and died. When the smoke cleared, Jack Zuda disappeared, and he was nowhere to be found. With Al Capone in jail, in 1930, Joe Aiello returned to Chicago, despite the warnings of Stefano Megadino and Salvatore Maranzano. He had finally achieved his goal, and he was elected president of the Chicago Unionne Sicilianne, and the time of counting down the minutes left in his life began. Al Capone was getting out of jail in May, and his men were making the city safe for his return. The Capone gang was looking to eliminate anyone associated with Aiello or the Northside gang. On July 23rd, Aiello man Ashcan Pete Inserio was in his soda shop at 448 North Elizabeth Street when 2 men walked in and shots rang out. The 2 men fired 12 rounds, half of which hit their mark. Inserio was still conscious when the police arrived and they asked him who shot him. He said, "I don't know, but they did a good job." He would die the next day. With all this heat on, George Moran ran off to Cleveland, and Jack Zuda was hiding out at the Lakeview Hotel near Delafield, Wisconsin. but the Capone gang had eyes and ears everywhere. On August 1st, 1930, Jack Zuda was in the hotel's pavilion when 3 men walked in carrying weapons. 2 of them went to the bartender and told him to be quiet. Jack walked across the dance floor unaware and dropped a nickel into the automatic piano, picked his tune, and turned around smiling. His smile went away when he saw a man aiming a pistol at him, and then shots rang out. Jack dropped to the floor with a bullet in the chest, and then the other 2 men came over and put more bullets into his body before hopping into a car with Illinois license plates and escaping. On May 25th, Peter Plessier, another Aiello man who specialized in extortion, was found in the alley off West Grand Avenue with bullets in his brain, jaw, and shoulder. 2 kids told police that they had heard the shots and saw 2 men hop into a curtained automobile and drive off. Capone's pressure was not always fatal, though. Sam Bruno was a partner with Joe in Aiello and Bruno photography. On June 9th, he was snatched off the corner of Armitage and Laverne Avenue and forced to ride with 3 men, 2 of which kept pistols pressed into his ears for the duration. Luckily, he was kicked out of the car on the north side. He immediately went to the police, but he refused to identify his assailants or reveal what was said to him and told the cops he didn't know why anyone would do this. He was given a police escort home and got out of Chicago alive. Joe Aiello knew that his life was in danger, but he needed to be in Chicago and he tried to be smart about it. He was hiding at the house of Presto Giacomo, but Capone's men found out, and he found out that they found out. Not wanting to end up like his predecessors, Joe thought it would be best if he left town. At 8:20 p.m. on October 23rd, 1930, a call was placed to the yellow cab station at Madison Street and Kedzie Avenue. The caller asked for a taxi to be sent to 205 North Colma Avenue and for the driver to ask for Mr. Presto. When the driver, James Ruan, got to the address and went into the vestibule, he did not see a Presto listed. In fact, all the buttons had been pulled out. He kicked on the door, but no one came. He went back to his cab and flashed a searchlight onto the building. In one window, he saw 3 shadowy figures looking down. He went back to the vestibule and kicked again. This time, Joe Aiello came out. Ruan walked to the cab a few paces ahead of Aiello. When he went to open the door, he noticed a window opening in the building across the street at 202 Colmore Avenue. Then a man stuck something out the window, and shots rang out. The chatter of a Tommy gun sent lead whizzing past Ruan's head. He ducked and heard Joe moan and saw him take off running. He was staggering and barely able to keep upright as he ran toward the side of the building looking for safety. But he found none. What he found was another machine gun nest. As Joe yanked at his gun trying to defend himself, shots rang out. Another barrage of lead from the 3rd floor of a building on West End Avenue finished Joe off. He crumpled to the ground filled with lead. Ruan called for help, and an off-duty police officer who heard the shots came and helped him get Joe's body into the taxi, but it was too late. Joe had 50 to 60 holes in him, and almost a pound of lead was taken out of his corpse. In his pockets, he had a bus ticket for Brownsville, Texas. When the cops went to the rooms where the shots came from, they found over 1,000 cigarette butts, leftover takeout, dirty dishes piled up, and a half-eaten box of candy. They also found out that the first room had been rented 10 days prior and the second 4 days prior. Several of the payment checks bore the names of well-known Capone gunmen: Joe Fiore, Joe Russo, and Louis Little New York Campagna. No one was ever arrested for the murder of Joe Aiello. Joe Aiello did not receive a funeral like Mike Jenner, Samud Samatuna, Tony Lombardo, Paty Lolordo, or Joseph Guinta. His body was transported to New York, where he was buried in Riverside Cemetery in Rochester. And that, my friends, is the skinny on Joe Aiello. I hope you guys enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. Hope you learned some things about Joe that you didn't know before. If you're new here to the channel and you like what we do, you want to join the gang, first thing you got to do is you got to go out there and you got to bump off that subscribe button. That's the first thing you got to do. We can't take you serious if you don't do that. Second thing you got to do is you got to break that thumb and you got to ring that bell and set it for all notifications so you don't miss nothing. All right. Like I said before in the last video, got some new Shots Rang Out merch in the stores. Cups and shirts and hoodies and all that good stuff. Go down there and get yourself something nice. If you want to help support A Few Bad Men, help support these videos. They take a long time to do. There's a few ways you can do that. You can join the Patreon channel for $5 a month. Exclusive videos. I got some videos on there that I don't have on the channel. Also have videos on there with images I can't show on YouTube. So for $5 a month, you can get that. Or you can go to the YouTube membership, and for $5 a month, you can get the same thing. The videos I can't show on YouTube. Okay? So listen, I'm working on a bunch of things right now. So videos may come out a little slower, but I'm doing something else with that time. All right, so just be patient with me, guys. I got some good stuff coming out. A few things that could help take this channel to another level. All right, I'm done yapping. All right, listen, this has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean and don't take any wooden nickels. I'll see you in the funnies.